What I ended up deciding to do was to simply continue to about what I said at the end of the previous episode. I did just stop recording and start again, so that we would just be exactly where we were before. Also saves me time of having to walk back here, especially if I end later episodes towards the end of a chapter. It would be an unnecessary expenditure of time. So here we go.
So this hole in the ground was kind of a difficult thing in some ways. It's a bit of a challenging aspect of the game. Because, in some ways, it kind of like, I think for me, we wanted to have this kind of this pit here, and I wanted the player to be able to actually go as close as possible and like look over the edge and you know, kind of have this feeling of dread and stuff. But the other issue that we faced was like, what happens if the player just jumps into the hole? Like we have no real death in the game, and from a design point of view, Dan, I mean, I don't know what you
it was
thought.
really hard because you know, it was a game where we couldn't let the player die. We didn't want to have respawns, but we had to handle the fact that there would be both accidents where the player would fall off a cliff or something, but also the deliberate urges of the player. You know, the first thing you're going to do is go, great, there's an ocean, how far out can I go? Or there's a cliff that's really high, can I jump off it? And how do you have death in a game where you can't have the player die? Because if the player starts breaking up the experience by dying and reloading, then you're in you start breaking the experience a lot. So
yeah, I mean, we didn't want to also have like artificial boundaries, you know, where it's like an invisible wall. Like if you take a look through the game, you'll never see a place where you think you can get to, but you can't. There's always some kind of actual natural boundary or man-made boundary. So yeah, that was the other thing. We didn't really want to create this invisible wall around this thing. So
it kind of, the whole drove the way in which that sort of the very weird audio visual, probably one of the most dreamlike bits in the game, where if you do die and you get the kind of the heartbeat and the strange flashes of visuals. And I think in a lot of ways, if we hadn't had the hole there and we hadn't had a place where we go, right, players will jump in this hole, we have to start from that basis, they will throw themselves down this hole, it kind of gave us the impetus to really, really focus on it. And I think the stuff like the drowning deaths and the cliff deaths are strong because the hole was there, and I'm not sure if the hole hadn't been there, whether or not we'd have arrived at that way of handling it, which I'm really proud of. I think it's a really incredibly creative, interesting way of handling a player going out of bounds and of actually being able to reset the game when the player's basically done something you ideally wouldn't want them to do.
yeah, and I kind of think it fits well with the theme of the game as well, because you don't really know what's just happened.
Yeah,
it's not like you hear a death sound and then you kind of respawn. It's this kind of like very soft, very ambiguous change. You know?
There was a point in the original mod where if you died, it would do the whole Half-Life major fracture detected. It always brought a really good tone to the game.
Yeah, we saw that in the last episode, but I'll do it again for you.
Come back.
So other than jumping in this hole, and there are a few cliffs around the place that you can also jump off and experience the same sort of death or, you know, surreal resets. But other than those, and walking out into the ocean will get you killed as well. These are not things I was aware of, because as I go through a game the first time, I'm not inclined to do those sorts of things. I stay in the moment. I want to be immersed. I don't think what happens when I jump off this. I think I'm going to die. I don't want to die. So
one of the really important jobs of a composer, I think, is to provide the player or the listener with different emotional tones and states. And up until this point in the game, the music has been very sparse, very intimate, and very isolating in a way. But the island is also a beautiful and magnificent place, and what I wanted to do at this point for the first time in the game is to create something that was really epic. So we go from that shift in scale where it's very intimate and small to suddenly realising that this is an extraordinary and magical place to be, as well as a difficult and quite sad and melancholic place to be. So the string players were instructed at this point to play with much more vibrato. Up until this point they've played in a very sort of Scottish style actually, no vibrato, very plain playing. But this was a really beautiful cue to write actually, because that has that scale. You suddenly realise that the island is really big, and you have this beautiful vista, and the music then shifts so the player can actually just for a moment, I think, enjoy being where they are.
Yeah, I think that's it. Can I? Yeah, I was going to say, this is actually one of my favourite parts of the game. It's just where everything, all the elements kind of come together perfectly. You've got the music, which is just epic, as Jess has said. You've got the landscape, which is kind of like this big open space. You've got all the little bits and pieces that I put into the detail of the environment, like the movement. There's leaves blowing around, there's the clouds in the sky. There's the mist rising off of the grass, and then you've got Dan's voiceover coming in there, and I think it's just like all of these elements coming together and just in perfect synergy, and just kind of, it really brings chills up your spine.
And the way she constructed the music at the beginning of the hill, that piano climb obviously coincides with the harsh climb up this hillside to get up to this lonely house. I wouldn't say the music makes me enjoy being here. I think it just adds to the feeling of isolation and the depressive feel. I mean, which is enjoyable in a strange sort of a way. So I guess that's what she meant.
Inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table, and I think it's the one instance of randomisation in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because the idea that Esther was pregnant when she died changes everything emotionally about how you understand the story. And not to say that you don't care as much if you don't find it, but it just adds this other layer of just the ground falls away from him the first time I saw it, and the meaning of the crash in Esther's death just means so much more when you go, it's not just about her, there was an unborn child here. And I think that's where the randomisation just hits its absolute peak, because it's one tiny detail that may or may not be there, but if it's there, it's going to fundamentally change the way you feel about the entire thing. And that's the strength that the randomisation elements in Esther kind of provide, that you go, you're likely kind of feeling about the story and your understanding about the story can be changed so absolutely by the occurrence or not of one tiny little prop detail. And that's something which, those moments I think are what make it really, really special. So it's for me, it's almost like the most important prop in the game, because when it happens, it's so profound.
Yeah, and it's again, it's just something that makes each playthrough more personal, I think. This is what I love reading about, people finding these things and going, holy shit, I've just found this one thing that's going to change it. It's changed my interpretation completely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm glad they were here this time. I certainly didn't notice them any other time. Hopefully
Inside the bothy, there
damn.
is a randomised chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table, and I think it's the one instance of randomisation in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because so as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting, because when we made it, we kind of had to, we kind of called it a ghost story, but there was no intention really. We kind of wanted this dreamy, hallucinatory type thing. But when it came out, people started coming back and saying, this game is absolutely terrifying. I was really, really frightened. And that was really amazing. And I think it's because nothing happens. We're so trained in games to go, there's stimulus all the time, that if nothing happens, you're waiting for something to happen. And kind of, I tend to go back to again and again the whole sequence in Dead Space 2 when you go back to the Ishimura, and it's like the best bit of Dead Space 2, because for what feels like hours, but it's probably only about 15 minutes, nothing happens and no necromorph comes at you, and it's absolutely terrifying because it's just this space and you're just left in it. So I think the kind of the bird here is really interesting because it can actually really, really make you jump. But I don't know if that was part of why people were saying that the game was really scary, but it was a real surprise when people started coming back and saying, this is a frightening game. And I don't know how much of that is to do with the ideas in the game are frightening when you think about them, and how much of it is to do with just the emptiness and the lack of kind of things in the game make it a really quite stressful or quite frightening place. But it was a real surprise, I think, that sort of reaction from a lot of players when we shipped it.
That is strange. I wouldn't say this game is frightening in the very slightest. I didn't feel that bird was a jump scare at all. I just thought it was more of a interest focal point. Like, oh look, there's a bird. Interesting. But it's a depressing game. It's not scary at all.
So one of the things that influenced the visuals quite a lot was the tech limitations at the time, and also the kind of themes of the game. Like, tech-wise, we were never ever gonna kind of achieve photorealism, and I think that was a good thing. I mean, really, it made us sort of stretch out into other areas, and for me as an artist, it kind of made me think a little bit more creatively. I did a few tests at the beginning, and when I realized this wasn't possible, I kind of went back and I kind of did some research on different styles, and one of the ones that really struck me was this kind of impressionistic painterly style, where it's kind of like there's just enough shape and color there for you to form an image, but a lot of it is just your imagination. It's kind of like the believability of the environment is in your mind. So this is something that I really wanted to bring over into the game, and you'll see a lot of landscapes that kind of look very surreal, very kind of unreal, and that's mainly due to this impressionistic style.
Nice. Yeah, I would just say it was a mystery, melancholy, contemplative game, not horror or scary at all.
We should probably talk about some of the inspirations behind it. I'm on a strict you don't talk about Stalker kind of thing going on here. And when Rob and I started talking, I think one of the first things that we kind of discovered was how much we're both obsessed with Stalker. And I think that was one of the major things behind it in terms of when people talk about game inspirations. I mean, for me, there's a lot of FPS stuff in there, Doom, System Shock, but I think Stalker probably more than anything else. And Roadside Picnic, the Strugatsky novel that Stalker's based on, of the idea of this incredible space that you didn't understand, that's simultaneously beautiful and threatening. And I think sort of Tarkovsky's kind of films kind of play into that as well, particularly his version of Stalker, that you want to have this place that you feel rather than think about. And for me, that was like really kind of core to all of the inspirations for the game, was this is a space that is about feeling, not thinking.
Yeah, I think the movies in particular, I think I hadn't watched the movies. I'd read the book and I played the game, but when I watched the movie, it kind of all made sense to me, like why I like the game so much and why I like the story. It's just like every shot is like a painting. It's like every shot has its story to tell. There's very little dialogue in the actual movie itself. There's just these long, lingering shots, and each shot is amazingly beautiful, and in its kind of desolation. And for me, that was like a huge influence. You know, like trying to bring some of that through into the environments. So that is definitely something I'm going to struggle not to talk about. But the game as well. I'd say the actual Stalker game has a big place in my heart. Like gaming wise, it's one of the reasons I got into game art in the first place.
Yeah.
So that to me is a big part of it too.
No, that's very interesting, because Stalker is, as they said, a first-person shooter. I guess the landscape bits of it are sort of similar. I can see now how they were sort of influenced by that. And I was having not so much a discussion, but I'd mentioned the kind of games that I was into in someone's Twitch video the other day, and the people commenting well, one guy said, "Have you played Stalker? It seems like you'd be very much into that." And I'm like, I tried it, but it wasn't really my thing. And it's very interesting that these developers referenced it as something they were very much influenced by, there being a very atmospheric, well, all the things that they just said, similar to this game, apparently. But I didn't really feel that. I mean, sure, it has its own sense of atmosphere, but because it's a first-person shooter with guns, and there's a lot of NPCs around with guns, for me, as a player at least, I find it very difficult to... if the gunplay is difficult, and in Stalker it is, for me, at least, for others apparently not, I was more focused on just hiding behind stuff and not getting my head blown off. Because people could snipe you, and do often, from wherever a gun will reach, and that can be a very long way. So if you're just walking around like this going, "Oh, isn't it an amazing, desolate, immersive location?" Shot to the back of the head, which for me ruins it. So I didn't quite feel that with Stalker, the thing that other people seem to feel. I would only feel it if there were no guns and no NPCs in the game. Otherwise, I'll certainly play it again. Yeah, so that was my impression of it.
One of the more interesting and challenging things to do in the visual side of things is to kind of create an emotional connection with the player. With the music, it's very strong, and the dialogue can kind of help you to feel what the character's feeling, but to kind of really create an atmosphere and to create emotion, it's very difficult. So I designed a few things very subtly within the environment to kind of plant imagery into your mind and kind of make you feel certain things. With this shipwreck on the beach, you can kind of, like, if you look at it from certain angles, you get this real, like it's like a cross sticking up. It's this kind of semi-religious imagery, but it really kind of, it's not obvious, it's not in your face, it's just kind of like something that makes you feel like something you know. And so like there's a lot of deliberate attempts in the game to recreate that feeling, and it's kind of hard to point out in many other places, but it's done in a way where every single rock, every single plant, every single cliff face has been deliberately placed and designed in a way to try and make you feel something in the game.
So I've attempted to make it surreal, but also keep you grounded, so that you understand and feel like you're really here. Gives you things to emotionally connect to.
This is another of my favourite bits in the game, where you come along the edge of the sort of gully and you find hundreds of books, and it's one of the first times where most explicitly there's the suggestion that nothing you're seeing is real, because there's just no way that this can exist, and it's a really amazing, uncanny moment. But it works, I think, for me, because you just go, I don't understand it, but it's lodged somewhere in my head and I can't get rid of it and I can't unsee this. And I think for me, like in terms of my influences from books, I mean, there's the obvious sort of stuff like with Burroughs, Cut Up and things like that going on. But it comes to the kind of books that I really love, that, like Roadside Picnic, or the other one by the Strugatskys as well, I absolutely love, is The Ugly Swans, that's just full of these images that you go, I don't understand, I literally have no idea what's going on here, but I can't shake it, it's just got its hooks in me. And I think more recently you've got books like Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation does this so well, where nothing is understandable, but you feel the logic, but you can't understand the logic, but you feel like the logic's there. And that, I think, is a really powerful thing that games are so good at doing, of creating these things. And I think where a lot of game writing for me becomes kind of the wheels fall off it, is that they have these amazing ideas and then suddenly there's this huge rush of going, right, we developed this mythos and we've shown you all the tips of the iceberg, which are really interesting, but now we're just going to show you the whole iceberg. And actually that's never that satisfactory as a player, because it robs the mystery. And I think the best game writing is those kind of moments where you go, I feel like there's something just outside the edge of my vision or just on the edge of my hearing. But it's the confidence to go, that's it, that's all you get, and the rest of it is up to your imagination. And I think it does loop back to games like Stalker. I think Skyrim at its best does it so well, where you just have these moments where you think, I want to know, but it's going to be down to my imagination to draw those things. And the player's imagination is the most powerful thing you've got in your design kit. There is nothing you can put on screen, there is nothing you can do with audio, there's nothing you can do with dialogue that will ever be as powerful as the player's own imagination. So if you oversell the idea and oversell the image, what you're actually doing is you're kind of not only robbing the player of the opportunity to invest in the game, but you're also fundamentally opting for a weaker tool than what the player can bring to the experience themselves.
The suggestions of things is often more powerful than the thing itself.
One of the really important images in the game is the radio mast, and the soundscapes that I wrote for the game are really tied into this idea. So it's the concept of the tortured sounds that they're so broken down, they're so manipulated, and it really is supposed to represent the inner state of the protagonist at this point. It's that fractured understanding. So it kind of works on two levels, actually. We have the narrator who's trying to understand the journey that he's on, and we also have the audience's journey and their struggle for comprehension to understand what's going on in the game. So this distortion, this breaking down, this fragmented, kind of tortured sound really ties into the idea of the radio mast and that idea of communication, actually, that the game is trying to communicate something to you, the narrator's trying to tell you something, but it's so difficult to understand what that is.
I didn't. She's talking about the music cue we got during a previous commentary when I originally approached her. A very mechanical, disturbing sound. I didn't make the connection with a radio tower myself, but it is the first real solid cue, to me at least, that when he was talking about the books being a cue that this is a dream, but I didn't feel that. I just felt like someone had collected books and dumped them here, or they'd washed ashore for some reason. I didn't make that leap of the surreal. I just thought there's probably some explanation for this, so I don't know what it is. But the demonic sounds as you approach here was my first inclination that something isn't right. Have we gone mad? I mean, and then they do this, you fall down and take a while to get back up, and you hear him breathing and sort of grunting, getting his wind back, which grounds you back in the reality of you are really here, this is really happening, you're just a dude walking around, which maybe they'll talk about in a second.
The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point. It's, we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront. And it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's really designed to be a very different experience compared to the rest of the game.
This for me is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing, it has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song, and with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it, and it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do, and they take something that you've created and they just shove it up into the next level and make something that's good into something really extraordinary. And also for me, I think it's a point where the environment art and the music just meld so beautifully and so seamlessly into one. I mean, on a personal level, I've played the game hundreds of times now, and I still enter the caves and I look at Rob's work and I'm just absolutely overawed, just gobsmacked by its beauty. And I just think it's a really magical moment in gaming for me, actually. I know that probably sounds really dramatic, but I just think it absolutely hits something where everything just works together. And the music is so dreamlike. You know, Rob has talked about the journey through the body, and I think that's absolutely, for me, the music becomes so organic and fluid and actually very feminine and female at that point. You're hearing the voice of his love.
Right. So apparently we're playing as Esther, who was pregnant and died. That was lost on me.
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves and games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look from it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those, it's great paying other people's work compliments. I enjoy that because you never feel like you're being big-headed about yourself, but I think it is, I think particularly it does come again down to that blend between the audio and visuals that just, it's a real high watermark. I kind of, it's one of the areas in all of the games we've made that I'm most proud of.
I think as well, you think you know what you're getting with Dear
Yes.
Esther for the first 45 minutes of the game, wherever we are at this point, and then you step into something completely unexpected and completely new, and I think it just throws the player such a curveball in such a wonderful way.
One of the things they haven't talked about, and one of the things I enjoy the most about the game is the sound and the sound design and how much detail they've bothered to put in it. Even just submerging yourself in this water sounded amazing. Something you don't even get in AAA games. They sort of brush over it, but they've really gone to town on the environment sounds. When as we come up to this, also, I mean, it just went through several different layers of texture as we approached it. It gets louder. See, there you go. Just got a lot louder, a lot slappier on the water on the rock. It's fantastic.
I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do. And you're trying to deal with all the different variations of things, that if a player does this, then this. And we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time, about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer or as a creative is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head, and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction, there's not a huge number of them in the way that there might be with a very mechanically complex game. So you can really heavily focus on what is the game experience that's being played out within the player's sort of mind and heart at the moment. And there are other, sort of, I know this is a kind of a way of approaching game design that has become increasingly popular over the last few years, and like Journey was a really, really good example of that game company really focusing on what's the emotional experience of playing this game. But I think, again, it's probably one of the reasons why Esther has lasted as long as it has done, because it's not a mechanical exercise, it's an exercise in trying to inspire you as a player to have the deepest experience and the deepest engagement, and to really run the game in your own head rather than something that you're sitting 6 feet away from kind of interacting with. I hate interaction as a term for that. I think it becomes very cold and mechanical and systems driven, and really interaction is completely trivial and pointless if there isn't an emotional engagement with the player and you haven't moved it away from the screen and into the player's head.
Well, he's basically talking about immersion, and certainly some games attempt to be as immersive as possible, and other games not. That is there to be gamey, to get the high score, as it were.
What's really important to me is that Dear Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod, and if the Half-Life 2 modding community hadn't championed it and celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me, the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it has been inspired by it. This was championed by Half-Life 2 modders, and they made it what it is. And so if you've made something that the real kind of hardcore of the hardcore, in terms of these are first-person shooter modders, have gone, this is really good and really special and we're behind this, then you've already got the support of a really amazing gaming community, and the fact that they championed it, we owe them a huge amount in terms of where we are. And I'm really proud to come out of that scene. I'm really proud to be a company and to be sitting here talking about a game that started life as a mod.
Yeah, I think they're the ones that have really kind of like pushed us forward and given us the passion to be able to take it to a commercial level and give us the confidence to make us believe that there's an audience for this kind of thing.
Dear Esther was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that this was my little first journey into thinking about how you write music for games rather than films. So I had this song that was a certain length, and Dan said, well, we don't know how long the player is going to take to traverse through that space. And I thought, oh no, he's right, and slightly panicked. So this was a very simple solution where the song was split in half, and then I wrote some drone music that could just play for as long as was needed as the player walks through the space, and then the second half of the song would seamlessly play. And it's very, very simple, but it's quite emblematic for me in terms of my career, because it was the first time that I had to think about the player. Because with film music, it's so simple. You know exactly what's going to happen when. But this concept of interactivity was so new for me. So I kind of looked back at it fondly, because it's quite a basic approach to, compared to something like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, where that was an open world adventure where I had to really think about the player and their movement through the space. So I kind of look on this very fondly, this moment in the game.
I'll have to watch this back and take note of all the games that they mention, and I shall have to play them all.
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther, really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you know at this point in the game, it's kind of the realisation is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island, and the idea that this kind of, again, the idea of communication, or the attempt or failing communication, or trying to speak through the coma, or whatever it is, however you want to interpret it. But the idea of putting the boat in the underground river really felt like it kind of reinforced that sort of dream-like kind of quality of the caves, of actually there's something really sad about this one boat, because when you see it go past, you know that even the boats aren't going to leave the island. Like, this is something which doesn't have a tidy, neat kind of like resolution, and there's, even if you don't sort of think about it to that sort of level of depth, there's just something, it's one of those things that I really love about games that you can do, where it's just a moment that has a really distinct emotional tone to it, that you go, there's a pause when you see that boat goes past, that I just think is, yeah, it's something special you can do with kind of media like games.
Now, I've played this game 3 times now, and I have never seen the boat that apparently he put in there just for me to have a special moment with. So I'm sorry about that. Ah, there it is. This is what I've been looking for. Three of the 4 urns of ashes. Another element that is up to your interpretation as to what the hell that means. Yeah, it's a real shame I missed that boat. Apparently one of those paper boats was sailing down the river. They didn't make it stand out enough. I'm busy looking at the cave and wondering where should I go now. It sounds like a powerful moment that I missed. That would have been surreal indeed.
In a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write, because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music, and this goes right back to the original mod, we wanted that to be the voice and for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break, so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening, and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant it really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult, because then it was, you had like 4 one-sentence lines in there, and each one of those had to have an absolute clarity and to really, really kind of work. So I think for me, it was really interesting. It's like the difference between writing kind of fiction and writing poetry. When you read really amazing poets and you have that incredible surgical precision where every single word is considered and placed so absolutely, and rather than being able to kind of, because the narrator rambles quite naturally, it was able to, you could kind of get into the flow of the narrator's ramble in other places in the level, and this was a real challenge, because suddenly I was having to write like a poet, of going, every single one of these words, every single cadence, every single sound has to be absolutely perfect, or it'll just feel like the narrator's voice is intruding on the rest of the experience. So it was, yeah, I think definitely the most challenging area of the game as a writer.
Curious. And the writing is fantastic all the way through, and it's all incredibly poetic, so I'm not sure why this was any harder than the rest of it.
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the wind, and it's a classic case of foreshadowing. So we know from this point that things are probably going to get bleaker, more difficult. And yeah, it's something that music does really well, I think, which is that emotional signalling and signposting.
We can hear what she's talking about now. And it's distorting again, it's breaking up.
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a
Yeah.
cave, right at the beginning of the caves where
Yeah.
everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we had this long corridor that's full of these kind of... It's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't
yeah.
it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory, and you know, it's kind of like this really frenetic moment for me.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath a mountain, and you feel
Yeah.
the weight of that mountain, and just I loved the idea when we were, you know, putting through it of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on. And it really is quite an explicit kind of thing of madness, of going, you would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the symbols is a lot more broken down as well. Like you see some symbols before like scattered around the environments, but at this point they're like right in your face, and they're kind of just, it's just total madness, you know. Any kind of meanings have been crossed over and confused, and you know, I think it really helps to bring the tension up at this point at a level as well. So you're kind of coming out of this dreamlike state a little bit.
Yeah, you kind of know that you're getting towards the end of the serenity into something that's a bit more disturbed than that.
Yeah.
But what does it mean?
This is a bit more of a contentious one because we disagree on this one. I struggle with this. With the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio. And I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension of the water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound. And I don't think there's any other way around that. And you need to have those moments where you do go underwater because it's so important. But it's one of the areas that's never sat very comfortably with me, because I feel like in a level which hasn't got a single edge in it, it's the one edge within it, and it breaks me.
And that's why I think it's so successful, because you've been lured into this completely hallucinatory, dreamlike world, and then all of a sudden, as a player, you're literally gasping for breath. You're coming up for air. And I think when we're talking about that metaphor of the body, for me, it's so about birth, and it's about this coming through the water, and actually it's a moment of realisation for me, but you're having to go back under again, and you're diving down. So for me, without wanting to sound incredibly pretentious, it's about the fight between the conscious and the subconscious, and that struggle. Booyah!
There's actually a really interesting thing about that underwater section there, though, is that, I don't know if you remember, but you had a certain piece of music that plays when you're underwater, and to me, I really like that. It's kind of like because at this point it's kind of like a very calm, relaxed type of a journey, and you go on the water and it starts to break apart a little bit, and it's almost like, you know, that kind of psychosis is still there. It's not complete bliss at this point, and and it helps to build the atmosphere up to this final jump.
So we're both saying that Dan's wrong.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's good. That's the way it should be.
As I was saying earlier, I love the soundscape of coming in and out of the water. I mean, they could have very obviously done away with that. They didn't need to put that there. It doesn't make the game harder or easier or anything. But it's just another tool of immersion, I feel, to both ground you in this situation, but also make you feel strange. So there is a way, it looks like, beyond this. And I actually fell in by accident, which I think is what they had in mind. You just suddenly, it sucks you into it, which is very shocking. Oh, and there's one actual dream sequence.
The motorway scene, the biggest new addition to between the mod
Yeah.
and the commercial version. This didn't exist in the mod at all. It was a completely new thing.
Yeah, it's well, I wasn't sure where the idea spawned from to have this scene, whether I just sort of went off or we discussed it, or I can't remember. You know,
I can't remember. Can you remember? It just kind of appeared, didn't it? And then
yeah, it was just this kind of. I think for me, actually, I remember being some technical difficulty between the drop and then coming out at the end part, but it was like it was the same thing that we dealt with in the past of like, how do we not kill the player? From a technical standpoint, I think it might have been something to do that, but it was also, you know, I can't remember where the whole thing came from.
I think it's my favourite point in the whole game, actually. I think it's just it's quite shocking, and it's so surreal, and it's so beautiful. And from an audio point of view, you have that baby's heartbeat bringing us back to the idea of the ultrasound. Was Esther pregnant? And it's one of those moments that I think everything just kind of collates together, and it's so unexpected.
Yeah, for me, it's like a moment of realization.
Yes.
It's like, it's, you know, it's coming to terms with something almost, you know.
Whether or not what actually is going on at the moment is real, this did happen. There's kind of an absolute. I remember playtesting it, and I didn't know that the car can get switched out with a hospital gurney, and I must have played it. I was like 3 or 4 times into playtesting it, and the first time it switched out and it was a gurney, and I really remember kind of sitting there and going, "Oh God, that's just," and really being just stopped in my tracks by it. And it's one of those weird things you get when you're making a game, that you know you'll never have those moments that a player does, where you know it all so well. It's really, really rare to be in a situation where you actually get a genuine, fresh player's eye view on what you're making.
Yeah, I was always a bit worried that it was maybe a bit too literal. Like we gone a bit too literal with that. But I think looking back at it now, there's still a lot of strangeness going on there. Obviously, the whole scene is unusual, but there's still these like very subtle details that are there that kind of still making you think, what does that mean? Like I think if you look closely, there's like coins scattered around and things like that. It's
And for me, it's, again, sorry to keep going on about it, but it's about layers of subconscious for me. That you start overground, you go into the caves, you go deeper, you're falling down, it's going down the rabbit hole effectively, and then you go to the deepest level, and that's actually the truth, that's the reality, that's what happened.
Yeah, that was lost on me. All this thing about birth and babies' heartbeats and ultrasounds and Esther even being a person. Sorry. They never mention her. Like...
So the admission really is that I did play fast and loose with the geography of the M5. There isn't actually a welcome break service. It's just outside the junction of Sanford. But
As
we
has
also
been
know,
pointed out to you.
players. I mean, what a thing if you make something that's based vaguely on somewhere in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. That's just the most amazing feeling. But I think what I really love about, what I think works really, really well in Esther, and again it's something that I think is really carried forward to our other games, is that a lot of the time we're not dealing with kind of like big, glamorous, amazing, epic places. It's a sort of like a ratty little island in the Hebrides. It's someone who lived in Wolverhampton. It's just outside, a service station on a stretch of the M5. And I think that earths what's going on. It gives it a realness as well, particularly when you sort of put it against the surrealness of the caves. Actually, kind of going, this is really surreal and this is really, really dreamlike, but actually I'm talking about, a car accident just outside a little chef, and it kind of that playing off those two things against each other.
It's like making the ordinary extraordinary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Alright. There will be enough content for, at the very least, one more episode. So we're at 49 minutes there. So I will save the rest. Hopefully we'll get the rest in. one more episode. That'd be nice and tidy. So there you go. I think this is the beginning of the 4th chapter. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.